Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so today we're doing something specific. We're taking just one research paper
Yeah.
and really digging into it, pulling out all the key insights. The goal is to get you, our listener, up to speed fast on a really crucial topic.
And that topic is invasive alien species, or IAS, in Europe.
Yeah.
It's a major issue.
Yeah, we're not just talking about, weeds in your garden here. IAS are described as this immense, often irreversible threat to native biodiversity. Some global bodies even rank it second only to habitat destruction. It's huge.
And the financial side of this, it's pretty staggering. So the paper we're focusing on today, it's from 2014. It's called Tackling Invasive Alien Species in Europe, the Top 20 Issues.
Right.
Published in Management Biological Invasions. The lead author was Joe M. Caffrey.
Okay.
And their whole aim, really, was to cut through all the noise and get experts to agree on the biggest hurdles.
Yeah.
The things actually stopping effective management across Europe. Structural issues, resource gaps, policy problems, the lot.
And just to underline why this matters so much for you listening, in Europe, something like 11% of alien species are invasive. And the cost, estimated at $12 billion a year for the EU alone.
12 billion. And that's likely an underestimate.
Wow. Plus, the paper stresses that the rate of invasion is actually picking up speed.
Yeah, potentially because of things like climate change, increased global trade. It makes finding solutions really, really urgent. Not just nice to have, but essential.
So the timing of this 2014 study was crucial then.
Absolutely. The authors saw this fragmented landscape in Europe. Different countries doing different things. Awareness was maybe growing, but the strategies weren't aligned. So this study was designed to provide that kind of harmonized guidance, something solid that policymakers could actually use, especially with the big EU IAS regulation that was coming down the pipeline then.
Okay, I get the why, but the how? That sounds tricky. How on earth do you get, over 100 experts, academics, politicians, people on the ground into one place and get them to agree on a top 20 list?
Yeah, it sounds like trying to herd cats, doesn't it?
Exactly. A recipe for deadlock.
Well, the method was key. They used a very structured approach.
Yeah.
It's called horizon scanning and issue prioritization.
Horizon scanning. Okay.
It was all organized at a conference in Ireland back in April 2013, the FIETS conference. That's Freshwater Invasives Networking for Strategy. And you mentioned the delegates, over 100 of them. Crucially, it wasn't just scientists in lab coats.
Right.
You had academics, sure, but also applied scientists, policy folks, politicians, and practitioners, the people actually dealing with this stuff day to day.
So a real mix of
A
perspectives.
very broad church.
Yeah.
And that was vital. It meant the issues they flagged weren't just theoretical. They were grounded in practical reality and what might actually be feasible to implement.
And I read they grouped the issues first, before any voting.
That's right.
Yeah.
To manage the sheer number of potential issues, they bundled them into four main pillars, kind of themes.
Which were?
Let's see. Biosecurity was one, then management and risk assessment. Third was policy, and fourth was economics.
Okay, that makes sense. Provide structure.
Exactly. And then the delegates scored the issues within those pillars. They looked at things like, how urgent is this? What's the risk if we ignore it? And crucially, how feasible is it to actually fix it?
So it wasn't just about identifying problems, but solvable problems.
Precisely. Then they voted. The final top 20 wasn't just the top 5 from each pillar, but synthesized from the highest-ranked issues across all 4. And what that showed was that the really critical roadblocks weren't confined to just, say, science or just policy. They cut across everything: ecology, money, governance.
Okay, that's a robust process. So let's dive into those findings. The list seems to follow that classic invasion hierarchy, starting with trying to stop them getting in prevention. So, theme 1, prevention, policy, and legislation. What's the core problem here, according to the experts?
Well, the big one, the overarching issue, is the desperate need for a coherent EU-wide strategy specifically for IAS.
Not just relying on other laws.
Exactly. Right now, most IAS fall under rules that aren't really designed for them, like the Water Framework Directive or the Habitats Directives.
And why isn't that good enough? What's wrong with using those?
Because those are mostly about protecting what's already there, existing habitats or water quality. They're fundamentally reactive.
Okay. Dealing with the mess afterwards.
Pretty much. They don't set clear preventative standards for stopping species arriving in the first place. And crucially, they don't give authorities the clear mandate or, importantly, the emergency powers needed for rapid action when something new does show up.
And that leads to conflicts between countries.
Huge legislative conflicts and delays,
Yeah.
Because there's no single clear rule book everyone follows for prevention.
And it's not just an internal EU problem, is it? Issue 4 in their list points a finger at international trade rules, too.
Oh, absolutely. Big gaps there.
They mention SPS recognized standards. What does that mean in this context? Why is the lack of those standards such a barrier for IAS?
Right. SPS stands for Sanitary and Phytosanitary. These are basically the global benchmarks, often managed under the World Trade Organization, the WTO. They cover things like food safety, animal health, plant health in traded goods.
Okay.
The problem is there's no internationally agreed body setting IAS-specific standards that are recognized under this SPS framework.
So you can't easily enforce preventative rules at the border.
It makes it very difficult. If your preventative rules aren't globally recognized through this kind of system, it hampers your ability to implement really robust pre-border controls, stopping things before they get into the EU, which means the default becomes post-border control, trying to catch the invader after it's already landed. And ecologically, that's often way too late. Financially, too, as we'll see.
Which brings us neatly to issue 13 about emergency powers. This is where that lack of clear rules and swift action really hits home, financially speaking. They use the example of Ludwigia grandiflora water primrose. The cost difference is just mind-blowing.
It really is. They estimated that controlling it early on in the UK might cost around £75,000.
Okay. Manageable.
But if you delay that intervention by just 5 or 10 years, the cost could skyrocket to $80 million.
80 million from 75,000. That's over 1,000 times more expensive.
Exactly. That kind of exponential increase is the starkest proof that prevention, or at least very early action, isn't just ecologically better, it's fiscally essential.
But the tragedy, as the paper points out, is that even when we know this, the system gets in the way. Conflicting laws, bureaucracy.
That's the crux of issue 13. Conflicting EU and national laws, or just slow permitting processes, can totally restrict the specific fast actions needed in an emergency. Think about using certain aquatic herbicides, for example. Legal hurdles or permit delays can turn what could have been a small, quick eradication into a massive, potentially uncontrollable invasion, leading to complete ecosystem damage.
And you mentioned the cost-benefit ratio earlier.
Yeah, the paper highlights that the cost-benefit ratio for removing small numbers of IAS early on can be absolutely massive, like 100,000s to 1. Yet the paperwork, the legislative conflicts, still block the necessary action. It's incredibly frustrating.
Okay, so if policy and prevention at the border are patchy, the next line of defense is catching them the moment they arrive. Which takes us to theme 2, early detection and rapid response. How good are we at spotting these new arrivals currently?
Not great is the short answer. The paper describes current surveillance as often relying on serendipitous finds. Meaning someone just happens upon it, a hiker spots a weird plant, an angler catches an unusual fish. It's not systematic, it's often just luck.
But the technology to do better exists now, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where issue 6 comes in. The experts specifically flag things like environmental DNA or eDNA sampling.
Right, I've heard of that, detecting DNA shed in the water.
Exactly. You can find traces of species like American bullfrogs or invasive carp just from water samples, even if you can't see the actual animals. It's incredibly sensitive.
Yeah.
And then there's next-generation sequencing, which can quickly identify lots of species from a single environmental sample.
So these tools could revolutionize surveillance, make it much more proactive. Why aren't they being used everywhere then? What's the holdup?
Well, the paper points to a sort of institutional reluctance. Cost is often cited as the reason.
But is it still that expensive?
Actually, the authors note that the cost of eDNA analysis had already dropped significantly, like tenfold, even back then in 2013-14, which suggests the barrier isn't purely financial.
So it's more systemic, a resistance to change.
Seems likely. A reluctance maybe to integrate these newer, non-traditional methods into the established, standardized monitoring protocols. Inertia, perhaps?
Technology is one thing, but even with the best tools, you need coordination, right? That seems to be the focus of issue 7 and 12, the need for structured warning systems and response plans.
Absolutely critical. You can have the best detection tech in the world, but if there's no clear plan or agreed process for what happens next, it's useless.
And the paper says most EU countries lack this.
At the time, yes. Most member states lacked formal, coordinated national systems for early warning and rapid response. The key recommendation, really strong consensus on this, was that each country needs a single designated lead agency.
One agency in charge.
Yes, with clear authority, dedicated resources, and the mandate to coordinate the rapid response effort. Crucially, the planning, the resource allocation, agreeing on who does all that needs to happen before an invader is detected, not scramble together during the crisis.
Oh, wait, that makes perfect sense. Let's shift gears a bit to the money side again and how we assess the threat. Theme 3, economics and risk assessment. You mentioned earlier that inconsistent risk assessment undermines everything. How bad is that inconsistency?
It's a major problem, highlighted in the paper. Risk classifications for the same species can differ wildly between neighboring countries.
Why? What causes that?
It comes down to different countries using different protocols for assessment, having access to different data, maybe different priorities. So one country might list a species as high risk, needing urgent action, while the country next door classifies it as low risk.
Which must make coordinated action impossible.
Pretty much. And it has major implications for things like trade policy.
Right, because Issue 9 brings up the idea of an EU-wide blacklist of banned IAS. If the risk assessments underpinning that list are all over the place, how can it possibly stand up legally, especially against WTO trade rules?
That's the tension exactly. The WTO rules basically say you can't restrict trade without solid scientific justification.
So the risk assessment has to be watertight.
Absolutely. The paper stresses that any proposed EU list of prohibited species must be backed by standardized, robust, transparent, pan-European risk assessments. Without that solid scientific foundation agreed across the board, the list is vulnerable to legal challenges under WTO rules, and the EU can't effectively restrict trade in those species. Standardization isn't just good practice, it's a legal necessity here.
And this links into another economic point, Issue 18. The failure to account for non-market valuation. What exactly is that for the listener, and why does it get ignored?
Non-market valuation is about trying to put a value on things that aren't typically bought and sold in a marketplace. Think ecosystem services.
Like clean water or recreation?
Exactly. Clean water filtered by a wetland, flood protection, recreational opportunities like fishing or boating, carbon sequestration, even just the value people place on knowing a native species or habitat exists, the existence value. When economists calculate the damage costs of an IAS invasion, they often focus on the direct costs, cleanup, lost crops, infrastructure damage.
It's the tangible stuff.
Right, but they often fail to include the loss of these less tangible non-market values. If an invasive plant chokes a river, the cost of removal is counted, but the lost value of fishing or the damage to the river's natural water purification function often isn't.
So the true economic impact of the invasion is actually far, far higher than what usually gets reported.
Massively underestimated, very often. And because policymakers might only see those lower direct cost figures, they don't grasp the full scale of the damage.
Which means they don't invest enough in prevention or control because the problem looks smaller than it really is.
Precisely. The paper identifies educating policymakers about these non-market costs and making sure they're included in cost-benefit analyses for IAS management as a major priority. You don't count the full cost, you'll never justify spending enough on the solution, especially on prevention.
Okay, that brings us to the final theme, which feels very relevant to everyone listening: knowledge, outreach, and management. The paper makes a pretty stark claim. Most IAS spread inadvertently simply because people don't know any better. Ignorance is a key factor.
Yes, that comes through strongly. Issue 15 talks about knowledge transfer and Issue 16 about outreach. There's often a big disconnect, a lack of communication between the scientists doing the research, the practitioners on the ground managing the weeds or pests, and the policymakers setting the rules and budgets.
Information isn't flowing properly between those groups.
Not effectively enough, and public awareness campaigns are often too general. The paper argues they need to be much more targeted.
Targeted at who?
At the specific groups most likely to accidentally spread these species. Think anglers moving between waterways, boat users, people involved in the pet trade, gardening centers selling ornamental plants that might escape. They need tailored information and clear guidance on how to avoid spreading IAS.
Are there examples where this kind of targeted outreach works?
Yes, the paper mentions things like the local action groups, LEGs, in Great Britain is a success story, getting local communities involved, empowering them to spot and help control invasions in their area. It shows public engagement can be really effective.
But it needs proper support.
Definitely. It needs dedicated long-term funding, ideally coordinated at a European level, which the paper suggests was lacking or fragmented at the time.
And that fragmentation isn't just in funding or outreach, is it? Issue 20 hits on the structure of government itself.
Yes. Fragmented national responsibility is called out as a major barrier. You often have one government department dealing with agriculture, another with the environment, maybe a third with trade or transport.
And they don't always talk to each other or have joined up policies on IAS?
Exactly. The experts in the study were pretty unanimous on this.
Hmm.
What's needed within each member state is a single responsible agency.
One clear leader.
One agency with clear lines of authority, the resources, and the mandate to oversee all aspects of IAS management, cutting across those traditional ministry silos.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground policy, tech, economics, outreach, but let's pull back for a second. What was the big, maybe unexpected takeaway when they looked across all 20 issues?
This was probably the most striking finding, actually. When they did the cross-cutting analysis looking for common threads, it turned out that 11 out of the top 20 issues, more than half, were fundamentally about knowledge requirements.
Knowledge. Not funding, not law, but knowledge.
Primarily knowledge. Things like training needs, better networking between groups, improving data sharing, targeted awareness campaigns, communication gaps.
Wow. So despite all the focus on needing new laws or more money or better technology, the biggest underlying problem identified by this huge group of experts was actually about information and communication.
That's what the synthesis suggested, yeah.
Yeah.
It indicates that the main bottleneck holding back effective IAS management wasn't necessarily a lack of scientific understanding or legal tools, but more a structural failure in how knowledge was generated, shared, and applied.
That really flips the script, doesn't it? We often assume the barrier is some complex scientific problem or a massive funding shortfall.
And those things are limitations, don't get me wrong. The paper does acknowledge inadequate funding for things like comprehensive risk assessments or for R&D into new control methods, biocontrol, maybe using electromagnetism, encapsulated poisons, things like that.
Right.
And it mentions that because IAS control is often seen as a public good, it's hard to attract private investment.
Sure.
But the dominant theme emerging from the experts' prioritization was this deficit in knowledge resourcing, communication, and strategic coordination based on shared understanding.
So the path forward recommended by the paper wasn't just spend more money, but invest smarter in knowledge.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Long-term investment needed to be directed towards building that knowledge base, improving communication networks, and developing common strategies grounded in shared information. The findings were explicitly meant to help policymakers shape the implementation of that then-pending EU IAS regulation.
And the overall message remains that investing smartly in prevention, in outreach, in deploying the tech we have, and in doing proper cost analysis that includes those non-market values will massively cut the long-term costs, both economic and ecological.
Absolutely. The ultimate takeaway is crystal clear. Prevention is not just a nice ecological option, it's financially critical. But getting there needs that consistent, coordinated action, better communication, and dedicated funding, things that were identified as lacking.
So let's leave our listeners with this thought. We've heard about that staggering potential cost-benefit ratio for early intervention stopping an IAS early can give returns of potentially hundreds of thousands to one compared to letting it establish. Knowing that, and knowing that the biggest barrier might actually be knowledge gaps and coordination failures, how might you, as an informed citizen, think about prioritizing political and financial support for prevention? How do we overcome that bureaucratic inertia when we know that complacency today leads to such devastating and often irreversible cost explosions tomorrow? Something to think about. That's all we have time for on this deep dive.